as you see that Chinese made their strikes, probably using our visit as an excuse.
It's a manufactured crisis. That doesn't mean we have to play into that. I think it would only play to Beijing's advantage. What we'll do instead is to continue to fly, to sail, and to operate wherever international law allows us to do so, and that includes in the Taiwan Strait.
Heightened tensions between the U.S. and China following the official visit to Taiwan by the U.S. Speaker of the House as the risk of military conflict in the Pacific grows. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. There were reported misgivings from the White House and the Pentagon, as well as concerns from U.S. allies, that the official visit to Taiwan by the second in line to the U.S. presidency, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, could lead to a dangerous military standoff with China in the Pacific. Pelosi's 18-hour visit to Taiwan was the highest-profile visit by a top U.S. elected official in 25 years and could well be an inflection point in Washington's official position on Taiwan. Since 1979, when President Jimmy Carter switched U.S. diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, the U.S. has maintained a so-called One China policy. China has reacted to the visit with unprecedented live-fire drills around Taiwan and a virtual military encirclement of the island, as well as other policy measures, including the suspension of regular channels of communication with the U.S. military.
Mr. President, how worried are you about the situation in Taiwan? Because China is kind of keeping a bit of a grip around the whole island now.
I'm not worried, but I'm concerned that they're moving as much as they are. But I don't think they're going to do anything more.
Do you think it was a wise move of the Speaker to go to Taiwan?
That was her decision. Thank you.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has long been an outspoken critic of China on human rights, most famously visiting Tiananmen Square in 1991 to mark the second anniversary of student demonstrations that were put down by the Chinese army. But is Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan a political stunt designed to secure her legacy before she steps down as Speaker of the House, or was it aimed at forcing the hand of President Biden by conducting an alternative foreign policy? Joining me now is former Republican Congressman John Fleming. Congressman Fleming, Republican members of Congress typically, traditionally, support the idea of elected American officials visiting Taiwan whenever they want. In fact, you led a congressional delegation on a visit to Taipei back in 2013 when you were still in Congress. But doesn't it send mixed signals when high-profile congressional delegations make a trip to Taiwan? Does it send mixed signals about who is conducting foreign policy when a Speaker of the House makes such a visit, whether it's Pelosi today or 25 years ago, another Speaker of the House, a Republican, Newt Gingrich?
Well, we've had an ambiguous policy towards China for many, many years. That was a diplomatic decision made way back in the 1970s. And so we treat them as, we treat the Taiwanese as friends. And we also try to conduct trade and friendship with China. However, the problem is that China has, well, take for instance, Hong Kong. They took back Hong Kong after the lease was up with the UK, and they promised that there would be open and fair elections and freedom of speech. But in fact, that's not turned out to be the case. They've actually been deceptive to the world about that. And so we know that China could do the same thing if they were to somehow take control of Taiwan. They could promise freedom for the people, but in fact, remove their freedom. And what's curious about all of this is after Nancy Pelosi did this, I guess because she realized that she may have broken some relationships that she might have had personally, she went back to say how free the people of China are, when in fact, everyone in the world knows that the people of China are not a free people.
But hold on, Congressman, because you mentioned the US's policy of strategic or diplomatic ambiguity. And we all hear quite a bit these days about diplomatic ambiguity when it comes to the One China policy. But it is quite clear, though, isn't it? I mean, let me quote from the 1972 Shanghai Communique. the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. In December 1978, the U.S. declared, and I quote, "As of January 1st, 1979, the United States of America recognizes the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China." So there is little ambiguity there. Is this a U.S. policy of strategic confusion rather than ambiguity?
Well, Ida, you leave out a very important part of that one China policy. It's one China, yes, but two systems. And Hong Kong has been a part of the other system, just as Taiwan has, which is that of freedom and democracy, which you do not find in mainland China. And that was exactly why I exemplified what happened in Hong Kong, is China has resisted the two-system policy.
But this isn't about Hong Kong, Congressman. I mean, it's quite clear here that the United States acknowledges that the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. I mean, there's no ambiguity there. And you add to this the statements that were made in recent days by the US president. One, he says there's a commitment to defend Taiwan when there isn't one. There isn't an official commitment by the United States. He later walks that back. The president also calls Taiwan independent, even though the US is officially neutral on the island status, according to its own one China policy.
Well, again, Hong Kong is fundamental in the two systems of one China. And that is that there was a solid commitment from China that freedom and democracy and freedom of speech would remain in Hong Kong, and it has not.
But we are, again, talking about Taiwan here. I wonder to what extent, as someone who has served in the previous US administration as Deputy Chief of Staff, as well as the US Department of Commerce's Assistant Secretary for Economic Development, to what extent is the crisis that we are seeing driven by the strategic and economic importance of Taiwan for the United States?
Well, what we have learned through the pandemic and also through past behavior of China, which has become more and more aggressive as they move eastwardly across the Pacific in its attempts to control the Pacific, is that we cannot become totally dependent on China for some of our trade. For instance, when it comes to semiconductors and chips and so forth, we know that Taiwan does a great job with that. So we are onshoring a lot of that. And under Trump, we had already begun that process.
And you mentioned Taiwan's high-tech industry. Taiwan is the United States' 10th largest trading partner. It is China's 5th largest trading partner. Now, whoever controls Taiwan, though, would gain access to its high-tech industry, including its semiconductor factories. Is the US's interest to maintain the status quo on the island?
Well, because I'm not part of the Biden administration, I can't speak for the Biden administration, but I can say this. China, through its policy of fusion between the military, the Communist Party, and their companies and the organizations that go with them, they love to work also through the educational system that we have here in the US, as well as industry, to take some of the technologies, innovations, and inventions that are here and incorporate them and put them into their military there. And so as a result of that, we need to feel confident that the inventions that occur within our borders, and certainly those of our allies, are not stolen and used against us, particularly in the military way. And again, Taiwan has been a very good friend when it comes to technology.
Former Congressman John Fleming, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ida.
Now, Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan coincided with a new push to increase US military assistance to the island and declare it a major non-NATO ally, a move that is certain to fuel China's anger. The US has provided over the years billions of dollars in military equipment to Taiwan, notwithstanding its One China policy and the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, which provided for defensive military aid to the island. President Biden approved his administration's first military assistance package to Taiwan earlier this month, a $750 million package, 3 days after Pelosi's visit. Beijing, which views these latest moves by Washington as a provocation, has expanded its military drills in and around Taiwan.
We anticipated that the visit would make news, and that the leadership in Beijing would present it as being provocative, and would seek to manufacture the crisis that we've now seen unfolding before us. I mean, nothing that's happened was unanticipated. In fact, we predicted it precisely as it was going to happen.
Could this all lead to a military conflict involving the world's major nuclear powers? How cautiously will the US proceed? Joining me now is Lieutenant General Daniel Figleaf, former Deputy Commander and former Acting Commander of the United States Pacific Command. General Leaf, you have served as head of US Pacific Command, so you know how dangerous this theater is and how strategic it is to both the United States and, of course, to China. Beijing reacted, as we all know, and as expected, forcefully, strongly to Pelosi's trip. We've seen extensive and unprecedented land, naval, aerial, live firing ammunition drills. How would you describe the current situation? Just how dangerous is it?
Well, I think it's more dangerous than it's been recently at other times. I always caveat my experience as the acting commander and the deputy PACOM by saying it's as much about opportunity as challenge. But there is high risk coming out of the aftermath of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
You say there is high risk, and we know that calls, reportedly at least, made by the US Defense Secretary, Austin, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, to their Chinese counterparts went unanswered over the last few days, that regular lines of communication between the two militaries have been suspended. How concerning is this state of tensions between Washington and Beijing?
Very concerning. I mean, it's impossible to give it an adequate description, but those communications can be very important in time of crisis. The ability to get through a specific challenge or risk is very important. And we are where we are at this set bit of loggerheads. I think it's important for both sides to get the matters out of the public limelight and quietly reestablish meaningful and productive communications in official channels.
You say we are where we are, but could this have been easily averted? I mean, we hear US national security officials say that they don't want to see this visit, quote, spiral into any kind of a crisis or conflict. They also say that China's military response is, quote, in line with what we had anticipated. President Biden, let's not forget, also stated a few days ago publicly that the military did not support Pelosi's official visit to Taiwan. He said at the time, quote, I think that the military thinks it's not a good time right now. So should they have done more? Should the White House have done more to stop this visit from taking place, given the risks it entails?
Well, that touches on, in fact, both of the key disconnects are touched upon here. The key disconnect for the Chinese is they simply do not understand the significance of separation of powers. They don't see it as real. They've said as much in public, but it is real. And with that separation of powers, the independent legislative branch, comes some internal politics. So that we can't wish that our system of government was different, because it's not.
But we're talking about the second in line to the US presidency, though. I mean, we're talking about a very high-profile visit. The Pentagon knew that this visit could trigger something quite dangerous, and what we have seen this far could be just the beginning. So just how do you explain that President Biden, that his defense secretary, didn't explain directly to Pelosi that her visit was likely to trigger this very dangerous train of events?
I don't know that they did or did not. But what I do know is we have a system of government that's well described and should be well understood, but isn't. And it's an important fundamental part of how a U.S. government works. I'm not judging whether or not the visit should have gone. We might be in a different place had it not, but we are where we are. At the same time, there's a disconnect on the U.S. side. And I don't think most U.S. officials truly appreciate the Chinese and especially Xi Jinping's commitment to unification with Taiwan. And I say unification because Taiwan has not been under Chinese Communist Party rule, may have been governed from China before, but we don't value that or appreciate it as much as we should. That doesn't mean we have to endorse any, and we don't, military action to do it. And we don't fully understand his own internal pressures, the pressures of nationalist sentiment in internal politics in China.
But given the fact that there could be military confrontation between two nuclear powers, that there is a serious risk, and talking about the disconnects that you describe, I mean, isn't there a major disconnect in the U.S. approach and its policy? When President Biden said that the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily because, quote, that's the commitment we made, was he out of step with U.S. policy and U.S. principles?
I'm not going to judge either president or either political system. That's, I'm a military man that knows that we're in a dangerous place and that has to be countered. And I will say this, that John Kirby, one of the spokesmen in Washington, gave a really clear explanation a few days ago of U.S. policy on China, one China and Taiwan. It was probably the best description I've heard, but it's too late, and it has to be believed. He alluded to the separation of powers. We've got to get back to the kind of communication between two nuclear powers, two nations that are going to define much of the coming decades based on our size, economic impact. So we got to go forward.
You mentioned the reality involving two major nuclear powers. Is the status quo in the Taiwan Strait already history, even in terms of conventional forces? China's military capabilities today are such that Beijing can challenge the United States. I mean, when the One China policy was crafted, China was not what it is today. Economically or militarily, it didn't have a blue water navy. Today, all of this has changed.
What's changed is the PLA has achieved some very impressive qualitative and quantitative advances, but nothing that gives it a hegemonic ability to have its way unfettered. And the actions submit that China's actions have galvanized not just internal U.S. opposition to military moves against Taiwan, but also ally and partner opposition to such an approach. And so neither side made things easier or better for them in terms of their goals. China's goal of unification or the U.S. and allies and partners' goal of a free and open, peaceful Indo-Asia-Pacific region.
Let me ask you about what I characterize as the policy shift that began under the Trump administration. The U.S. Navy sailed through the Taiwan Strait reportedly 13 times in 2020. Under Obama, the U.S. Navy sailed through the Strait 1 to 3 times a year. That's according to CSIS. $15 billion worth of arms to Taiwan were provided in the second half of the Trump presidency, including an $8 billion sale of F-16 fighter jets, which President Obama had opposed. Biden approved on August 5th a $750 million weapons package. From a strategic Navy angle, China's coast is surrounded by what could be described as an arc of U.S. bases and allies, whether it is South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, or Malaysia, not to mention Australia. If freedom of navigation is central to the U.S. doctrine in the Pacific region, is it not even more true and more vital for China's national interest? I mean, at the end of the day, who is threatening whose interests?
Boy, first of all, it'd be interesting if your viewers could grab a globe and look at the geometry of this arc that you just described. And once again, look at the quantity. The United States does conduct freedom of navigation, rule of law-based operations, has for decades. in the interest of keeping access for all legitimate parties, including China. So I am confident that and remind you that I'm not a U.S. spokesman. I don't work for the government or the DoD or military anymore, but I know the operations well and know that the U.S. intent is free and open access to the Indo-Asia Pacific region. I know the Chinese view is different. So thus, to avoid conflict, the two sides have to work together.
But since you do not represent the US government, as you state, could you see it from Beijing's perspective militarily, that it feels threatened by the US military presence
yes,
off its coast?
I can see it from their perspective without agreeing with their perspective. But that's the kind of disconnect that our two sides have to discuss. So I'm not saying they shouldn't feel that way. I'm saying that we have to work together to understand the perspectives, accept areas where those cannot be reconciled, but find ways to work where we can agree, where we do have shared interest. And our shared interest is peace.
Let me ask you, General, finally, about another piece of shared interest, strategic interest, and another aspect to this crisis and these rising tensions around the Taiwan Straits. TSMC, the Taiwanese conglomerate that supplies the entire world with microchips, including the US and Chinese militaries. It's the world's biggest supplier of those chips. Every military force, every major military force in the world relies on the most advanced, critical nanochips that are produced there. In case of a destruction or even the stoppage of production of these chips, the world's economy could be severely impacted. It isn't Ukrainian corn, however important that might be, that we're talking about. TSMC is probably today the most critical company in the world. It's the prize for whoever controls Taiwan at the end of the day. It could also be quickly destroyed by war. Does that further complicate Washington and Beijing's calculus when it comes to Taiwan?
It should simplify the calculus. It's in nobody's interest to have conflict on Taiwan for all the reasons you just described. So it should make this obvious. It doesn't because of the other disconnects. But once again, the focus has to be on reducing the tensions, reestablishing communication, and finding a way to go forward peacefully.
How much does the US stand to lose if this crisis escalates around the Taiwan Strait?
I can't look at it from a purely US perspective. It's what the world stands to lose. What China stands to lose. The people of Taiwan, the 23 million residents. This is not a series of calculations where there's a winner. There is no winner from conflict over Taiwan.
All right, Lieutenant General Daniel Figleaf, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the problem with diplomatic ambiguity is that more often than not, it comes back to bite you. For Beijing, its One China principle is clear. Taiwan is a part of China. Washington's One China policy, less so. Both acquiesce to a tenuous 4-decades-old status quo, but the recent US intelligence assessment that China is increasingly, quote, a near-peer competitor, challenging the United States in multiple arenas, is what lies at the heart of the issue, not Pelosi's visit, which is only a trigger. Now, since the Trump administration, the One China policy has morphed into a 1.1 China policy, and Biden is pursuing the same course. The US's policy of strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan, which was enshrined in a 1972 joint communiqué with the People's Republic of China, where the US acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China, is slowly peeling off, at great risk of a hot war down the road, or rather, down the seas. Unless you are Haiti, Belize, Palau, or 10 other small countries, you have de facto or de jure accepted that Taiwan is a part of China, and that includes the United States, despite Biden's recent pronouncements that he would defend the island if Beijing were to assert its sovereignty by force. And the US might well do exactly that, because what is at stake is not the freedom of 23 million people in Taiwan, but rather the standing of the United States in the world and its naval preeminence in the Pacific, as well as access to, or rather control of, the world's most advanced nano-semiconductors, which are needed by both the US and Chinese militaries and almost exclusively produced by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. And so, in short, what we are witnessing in and around the Taiwan Strait is not a struggle between democracy and autocracy, as Speaker Pelosi would have us believe. It's a classic superpower play, a very dangerous one at that, with unpredictable outcomes. Because with a bill before the US Senate referring to the self-determination of Taiwan and declaring it a major non-NATO ally, whether this bill becomes law or not, for Beijing, the US has already crossed the Rubicon. It might no longer be able to use its ambiguous one-China policy as a convenient fig leaf. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team in Washington. Thanks for watching.